Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending where you are in the world. But either way, happy Tuesday. And thank you for joining me, Marissa, and Dr. Charlie Catania for a behavior analyst talks about emotions and feelings. And during today's webinar, you're going to have the chance to earn some CEUs. And the way that you're going to earn those CEUs is by one, staying the entire time, and two, answering poll questions that are going to be popping up on your screen. So the way you joined was by using a unique link that was sent to your email. Please do not allow anybody else to use that link that is special to you in your name and email. Basically your personal registration. So if somebody else uses that link, then they're going to be signed in as you. And we don't want that. So then you're not going to be able to get specific credit. But anyways, make sure that you use that link to join. And if you join by dialing in with your cell phone for audio only, please also make sure that you've joined with that link. Basically, you GoToWebinar will not be able to record your attendance if you are dialed in audio only. You need to join by that link. Even if you can't hear, you can't see, there's some kind of technical issues that you are having, keep it signed in on your device anyways and stay dialed in, so this way you get the most experience that you can. But just make sure that if you need some kind of certificate, whether that's a certificate of completion or your CE certificate, that you are using that link that was emailed to you when you signed up for today. But alrighty, so if you have any questions for today, go ahead and throw them into the questions box. I'll be answering as they come in, the ones that I can. Otherwise, we'll have some time for Q&A later on. I sent out a copy of the handout a couple of hours ago from support@bds.com, but if you didn't get a copy of it or you signed up afterwards, like maybe you just signed up a couple minutes ago, go ahead and send us either, you can download it from the control panel. If you have trouble, send us an email to support@bds.com and we'll attach it there for you. Alrighty, but I'm gonna shut myself down and I'll go into more detail about purchasing CEUs and your certificates and stuff like that when the first poll question comes up. But for now, I'm gonna turn it over to Charlie.
Okay, greetings everyone. As I presume most of you know, this is part of a continuing series in which I've been talking about a variety of topics in behavior analysis. We're going to be running through the end of the year, typically the first Tuesday, unless holidays or something interfere with that. Welcome to you all, and I appreciate having you as an audience. These topics are ones that I have addressed in writing here and there, but I plan to do it and do that sort of thing in more detail. And in fact, some of what I'll be talking about is drawn from my recent text, which is available from Sloan Publishing. And I'm hoping to do a second edition, and some of these topics that I'm talking about here with BDS are things in which I will be elaborating on what already exists there in the next edition. So by you providing feedback and asking questions, you can be helpful to me in trying to get this stuff right, because there's a lot of material. Some of these things are controversial, and we certainly want to be able to do what we can where behavior analysis can make contributions to much larger issues in our culture. Oh, and by the way, as you notice there, if you use the address at the bottom of that page, Sloan will give you a discount. Anyway, those of you who've been to some of the earlier ones will know that with sensitive topics like, for example, cancel culture and sex and gender and so forth, I've typically included trigger warnings. So no trigger warnings today, but be advised that we're going to talk about positive emotions like joy and anticipation, but we will also consider negative ones like grief and anger. So stay calm, stick with this, and we'll get through it all together. So I would like to try to cover 5 main questions about emotional behavior. I want to start out at the beginning by asking whether emotional behavior is affected by operant contingencies. We tend to think of emotional behavior as being triggered by critical events and so forth. do operant contingencies like reinforcement and punishment make a difference? In order to make sense of some of the ways in which we talk about emotion, especially in our culture, we want to ask how emotions might have evolved. We'll look a little bit at some evolutionary history, or at least not in detail, but at least make some logical points about it. Then I would like to spend a little bit of time on whether we should regard emotions as causes of behavior. Um, Somebody says, I did that because you made me angry. Um, was anger something that we should regard as a cause when we're dealing with things? We're behavior analysts. We want to look for causes in the environment. And how do we reconcile our ways of looking at behavior with the way the everyday language bears on it? Then we have one of the really important parts of uh, the language of emotions, and something that Skinner introduced very early on in a paper of his called The Operational Analysis of Psychological Terms. We talk about emotions and feelings as being inside. If they're private, how can a verbal community teach us the language of emotions and feelings if it only has access to what's public about us? Um, can the politicians really truthfully tell us that they feel our pain? Um, Bad enough with the politicians, but can anybody do that? Once we get through with all of these topics, and assuming we have a little bit of time left, the question is, what behavioral criteria can we use to define emotions? Do we need to define them? And if we do want to define them, how will we do that? So those are the kinds of things I'm going to want to be doing today. And so let me start out. I mean, after all, behavior analysis, it started out with rats and pigeons. And even though that challenges lots of people who, as soon as they're talking, they recognize we're talking about non-human organisms, they sort of shut down and stop listening. I think it's important for us to begin that way, because the thing is, if we've got something that we look at in the behavior of a non-human organism, and we look at that creature and we say, oh, it's behaving fearfully, or that's an angry organism, or that's a happy one. All we have access to with them is what we can see, and we certainly don't have to worry about whether we're being misled because of the way they're talking about things, because they're not talking to us. So they give us a look at behavior that's in some ways simpler than if we're looking at the behavior of humans. With the behavior of humans, we've got a long verbal history that overlays whatever it is that we share with all these non-humans. I mean, after all, our verbal behavior is built on a substrate of all the non-verbal stuff. And so when we study rats, or when we study pigeons, or whether we study primates, whichever of those creatures, and they're not talking, then we're looking at the behavior that's a lot more like what our ancestors probably were before we humans, or our early hominid ancestors, began talking. So in this non-human example, I'm going to be talking about pecking orders in pigeons. That is a ranking in which you have a bunch of birds together. This could be chickens, or you'll see it in all sorts of in birds, in which any particular bird will occasionally be aggressive toward other birds, or will be attacked by other birds, and they tend to rank themselves. So once you get a particular bird that's a dominant bird that attacks all the other birds, the next one down in the line will attack those below it in rank, but will not attack the higher ranked birds. So once you've determined your rank, you can attack anybody below you in rank, and will not attack anybody, but would yield to anybody higher in rank. And these can change over time. A dominant male, as that bird gets older, may eventually become weaker and so forth, and eventually lose its dominant rank and fall lower in the pecking order hierarchy. Well, Skinner was interested in this sort of thing. It happened to be at a time when I was a graduate student, so I was involved in helping to get the birds set up, along with a colleague of mine named George Reynolds. And so he designed the apparatus in which he wanted to demonstrate the creation and the reversal of pecking orders. And in order to do that, one of the things he arranged was a feeder, or the magazine, as shown in this illustrations here, in which there were two different ways to operate it. In one of them, there was a treadle, a little platform here, and a bird could be taught to step on the treadle. They wouldn't typically do that spontaneously. Or on the other side was this vertical bar in which the bird could just sort of push up against it with its chest and make this bar operate. There were switches behind each of these. And the thing you do here, though, that was curious was Skinner would then arrange it so that we trained one bird to get food from the magazine when a little light came on, and this particular light came on for that bird. And when that little light was on, then the treadle would work, but only this first bird had been taught to use the treadle, and it would go over and then operate the treadle, get some food, and then move away. The other bird would not then interfere, but the other bird then, when another separate little light for it came on, would be able to push this vertical bar, and then that would operate the feeder too. So you've got one pigeon trained to use the bar when one color was on near the feeder, the other to use the treadle when a different color was on. So you could use one or the other color to reinforce the behavior of just one of the two pigeons, even though they were both there occupying the same chamber. It was actually a bigger one than this one. It was a sort of an arena. Well, actually, it went through several iterations. But Skinner then arranged a demonstration. And in fact, I know that this was filmed, and I saw the film a long time ago, but even though I've tried to make inquiries, I've not been able to recover the film, which probably came out in the late 1950s or the early 1960s. If anybody ever discovers a video clip from an old TV show which shows this demonstration, I'd love to learn about it because it's many, many years since I've seen it. So, okay, you've got these two birds. You can independently reinforce the behavior of one or the other. Notice that I say we reinforce the behavior. We're not reinforcing the birds. So here's the contingencies in the shaping of pecking order. A blue light comes on in the ceiling, and what we will do is whenever pigeon A starts pecking at pigeon B, we will then turn on its feeder light. It will go over and collect its reinforcer. Then the ceiling light changes to red, and when the red ceiling light comes on, whenever pigeon B pecks at pigeon A, at that point, we will deliver the reinforcer. And I just noticed, and since I've got this, let me fix that. That should be a capital B. So blue light, pigeon A pecks at pigeon B. Red light, pigeon B pecks at pigeon A. We also have a neutral color. When the light on the ceiling comes on green, we do not reinforce pecking by either bird at the other one. That's their neutral thing. They can go over in their separate. Now the thing about this is once we've got this going, if pigeon A pecks pigeon B when the blue light's on and pigeon B pecks pigeon A when the red light's on, we've got a reversible pecking order. Depending on the color, we've got A being dominant or B being dominant, and during green, they're at peace with each other. That's the experiment. But here's the fascinating thing about it. And by the way, we can talk about this now. I find it hard to imagine that we could get an institutional review committee to say it was okay to produce this demonstration these days. So this is a historical thing. I don't know that anybody's doing research on this, but here's the curious thing that happens. At the beginning, you could say the birds were dispassionately pecking. You know, they go over and they peck the way the pigeon might peck a pigeon key on the wall, the way a pigeon might peck at the ground, picking up seed. But what began to happen was the topography changed from that standard pecking to the characteristic topography of aggressive behavior. So when pigeons are fighting with each other, the aggressing bird, its breast feathers blow up, it stands high, and the bird that's the target of this aggression tucks its wings down, it crouches down. And so this kind of behavior, even though the only contingency for us would have been reinforcing the peck at the other bird, didn't even have to make contact, it turned into this aggressive behavior in which we saw this full-blown thing involving the feathers and the pot string. But the curious thing was the ceiling light changes color, and suddenly the feathers of the attacking bird, which are all expanded, making the bird really look big, they collapse. This bird, standing tall, suddenly drops down, and the other bird puffs itself up and becomes the aggressor. So it looks like this aggressive behavior um, was under the control of the contingencies, the color of the light in the environment. When the green light comes on, both of the birds, if one was aggressing, the feathers again drop down to the normal kind of calm posture. And the birds actually typically moved off to neutral corners and just left each other alone. So if aggression and anger are things we might want to call emotional behavior, here we have it under the control of a stimulus. So let me then stop and see whether you folks have been listening to this. So we're going to pause now for the first poll question, and Marissa will tell you a little bit and give you a little bit of background of what these are for. We'll try to get through these fairly quickly. We'll give you feedback when it's done and then move on to the next bit. Our main non-human example of emotional behavior has been, select one of the following. Do you want to read them through, Marissa, or should we let them?
Yeah, they can read them through for right now, and I'll say the answers afterwards. But go ahead, and a blue box should have popped up on your screens, where you should be able to select an answer and press the submit button to lock it in. Please do not submit your answers through the questions box if you have any trouble with this interface. They'll probably get lost, and determining your participation afterwards will just be kind of messy. So please, if you have any trouble with this interface and you had to dial in with your phone, audio only, go ahead, put your answers in either like a Word document or the body of an email and send them to me after the webinar, and that will perfectly suffice for your participation, as long as you are also logged in with that special link that was emailed. If you did not purchase CEUs in the store as of yet, that is okay. You can purchase them at any time, but I will be analyzing all of the data first thing tomorrow morning. So you'll get instructions to access your certificates by lunchtime tomorrow. Um, so if you want to access your certificate as soon as I send those instructions, then go ahead and purchase before then. You could purchase anytime before then, or you could purchase anytime afterwards. It doesn't matter. You can also just purchase and then follow those instructions within the email that I send tomorrow, to access like that. If you do not need CEUs, BCBA CEUs, and you just need a certificate of completion, then that you do not need to purchase CEUs in our store. That is automatically going to be sent for free, a few hours after we end here today. So as I said, you don't need to pay anything for a certificate of completion. Only if you need BCBA CEUs, you need to pay for those in the store, and that certificate will come tomorrow. But alrighty, I will shut down this poll.
I presume everybody has clicked on one of those alternatives.
Uh-huh.
Oh, let's see.
Alrighty. And here's the results. It looks like 7% say angry chest thumping, by male gorillas. 4% say lever pressing of rats during extinction. 88% say pecking orders in pigeons. And 1% say aggression shown by caged bears.
Hmm. Well, we know something about 88% of the folks anyway. Thank you, those of you. We'll give the others the benefit of the doubt of maybe having signed in late, but let's move on. Okay. Um, Now remember, the first question we had was, to what extent is emotional behavior affected by operant contingencies? And here we have this example of changes in aggressive behavior on the part of pigeons in which the response was one that was shaped by reinforcers, and it was brought under the stimulus control of the different colored lights at the top of the chamber. And if you say, well, okay, but that's just pigeons, let's consider Consider the human analog. You've got two graduate students. They're in the midst of a heated argument. They're on campus, and suddenly a prestigious faculty member enters the room. What do you think would happen? Suddenly everything is all, they're not going to continue the fight in front of this faculty member. So we speak of aggression, submission, their patterns of behavior. We talk about them as being emotional components, but those patterns were quickly turned on or off or reversed. We just changed the stimuli. We tend to talk about emotional behavior as elicited. I couldn't help it. What you did made me angry. But if you think it works that way, then you think that pigeon demonstration should be counterintuitive. It seems to imply that some features of emotional behavior are operant rather than respondent. But if you get examples, if you find it persuasive that in the graduate student example, you had this battle royale going on, and the faculty member comes on the scene and suddenly it's all sweetness and light, this is turning off emotional behavior. With the stimulus as surely as the green ceiling light in the pigeon apparatus made the birds stop fighting. So when we look at behavior that we call emotional, we have to look carefully. We have to be concerned not only about the respondent parts of it, the things in which we do have stimuli that may elicit things. I can imagine that if we were talking about really nasty aversive stuff, that the behavior we speak of as fearfulness, um, might have primarily responding components. But even there, uh, fear is something we can talk about in terms of whether or not some way of getting away from that stimulus is available. And it may be that fear is more concerned with the unavailability of things, because if we can escape, get away from it, then the emotional stuff may be a thing that we talk about in a different way. We usually speak of emotions as something inside of us, that they're inside, ready to come out under certain circumstances. And sometimes it's really hard to keep it in. Um, we talk about it being stored up, and you got to let it out. But we cannot find key pecks inside the pigeon when the pigeon is not pecking. We can't find reaches and touches inside ourselves when we're not reaching and touching things. So what happens if we start thinking about emotional behavior in the same way? Here's another example. And this one's much more practical, and I do refer you to the work of Rosales Ruiz and his colleagues at North Texas. Um, when you see aggressive behavior or fearful behavior in dogs, you get some that are that will get into a fight with other dogs, some that will just hide away and cower, or other pets. We will typically interpret them as elicited or emotional behavior. But some of it is operant behavior that's reinforced by keeping aversive events at a distance, because a growling dog may be less likely to be approached than one that's quiet and calm. So what Emilio, I hope I got to remember. Okay, what Rosales Ruiz did was to start working with dogs who were in trouble because they tended always to be fighting with other dogs. And he started to shape calmer behavior. Um, so what you might have is an aggressive dog, and you bring it into this long hallway, and at the other end of the hallway is another dog. And what you do is bring this other dog closer and closer to this aggressive one, and finally it begins exhibiting this aggressive behavior. It starts pulling on any restraint, it starts barking, and then you wait until you stop approaching as you get near this dog that you're trying to teach to calm down, and you wait a little bit, and just as you would in other kinds of things, you might in shaping, you might wait for change. As soon as the dog becomes just a little bit less aggressive, then you back off and withdraw the intruder dog, and then you do it again. Only the next time you may be able to get the intruder dog a little bit closer, and you keep on doing this. And you keep on changing the criteria for reducing the aggression. Over time, the aggressive dog becomes a friendly one. I find it startling how quickly he's been able to do this, but he does have data. I'm right now. I don't. I should have put the more detailed reference in, but um, uh, some of this can be done in just a few days or even hours, and boy, does that ever make a difference in the lives of some of these pets, because some of these aggressive dogs might be returned to the rescue center where they were from which they were adopted. And many of these dogs that are failures to uh, become non-aggressive when they become a human's pet, uh, some of them may eventually, if they can't be placed with people, may be put down. And so being able to shape that behavior and change it in an effective way, and you got to be really careful, get it to the point where the dog's owner is taught enough about maintaining this that you keep that behavior going, because you don't want to have relapses. So these are things behavior analysts can do. There's literature about this, and it ties in directly to the control of these kinds of behavior that we sometimes call emotional by environmental contingencies. With that, I think we're ready for another poll question. And let's see what you have to say about this one. The question will come up and you click on the appropriate box to provide your answer. Here we go.
Alrighty, everyone. Go ahead, take some time to answer this.
I assume that if anybody has any problems reading those, they can send you an email to ask for it to be read aloud or something, right?
Yeah, but I'll read it afterwards anyways.
Okay.
Everyone should be able to actively participate through the screen. So if anybody has any trouble, just send a question. But alrighty, I'm going to shut this down and thank you all for voting. And in the graduate student example, their overt emotional behavior was changed by, and 9% said an apology, 82% said the entry of a faculty member, 2% said an insult, and 8% said the entry of another student.
Thank you to the 82% who were paying attention. I've mentioned this before in earlier ones of this series, but there are questions out there in the field about the effectiveness of continuing education. And although there are reasons for not trying to require strict criteria, um, data like the kinds being collected here could someday be used to decide whether organizations want stricter criteria for whether people are paying attention. For those 12% or so who missed that, well, maybe you took a brief break, but try to be here for us, folks. Okay, let's now, okay, emotions. We got this big deal. We got all of these kinds of behavior to worry about. We've got joy and anger and fear and love and all the, um, uh, how might these how might these patterns of behavior have evolved? Part of it is concerned with also the emotion, the evolution of language, because we talk about emotions a lot, and we describe them and name them. So if you're talking about the evolution of emotions, the evolution of language, you find that those are interwoven. I won't go into the details here. We could spend a whole session just on this. But for our purposes, a couple of points are important. When we look at these kinds of classes of behavior, we want to look at their function, not their structure. What do they do, not what do they look like? And we also have to deal with three different levels of selection. It's not just talking about Darwin and the evolutionary kinds of selection that operates over generation. We've got to look at our kind of selection that occurs within the lifetime of the individual. operant selection or ontogenic. Um, and we also have to look at a third level, which we sometimes call sociogenic or cultural. Uh, Dawkins memes are a little bit like that, but memes are not really behavior, so it doesn't. But to the extent that you can pass behavior on from one individual to another, as that happens, some behavior is passed on more effectively than others. Some recipes will survive uh, transmission from some individuals to others, and others just never get very far. So those are the three dimensions of selection. But what about the language of emotions? So it has been argued that the expression of emotions drove language evolution. Because if you walk into a classroom and you ask students what was one of the most important things involved in language, well, it was so you could express your feelings. Well, the problem with that is that the way evolution works, it doesn't usually duplicate functions that already exist. So if language evolved as the expression of emotions, it was duplicating something that already exists, because you can always tell an angry gorilla. You can't tell it much, but you can always tell whether a gorilla is angry. It is great at expressing its emotions. And so if the gorilla is there um, and pounding its chest, or if it's baring its teeth and it's moving toward you in certain ways, that's one thing. If it's just standing there relaxed and yawning, that's something else. And your interactions with that gorilla are probably going to be affected, especially if you're another gorilla. So if a gorilla is already perfectly competent to show us its emotions, um, whether the emotions are anger, fear, joy, lust, you name it, gorillas are pretty good at doing any of those kinds of things. If language evolved, if that existed already, what reason would there be for language to evolve? Just so you could say it in words instead? Now, there's a simpler function of verbal behavior, and we'll save this with talking about verbal behavior in other ways. The minimal and irreducible function of language is that it's a very efficient way in which one individual can get another one to do something. Through verbal behavior, we do things by the mediation of others, and the consequences may be nonverbal, like we ask somebody to move something. I'm not going to try to do an experiment here and ask one of you to stand up, but or it can be verbal. We ask a question, we get an answer. This is a social function of language, and you can only see it evolve among organisms whose behavior is sensitive to social contingencies. And that is the key to a behavior analytic account of language origins and language evolution. Everything else, truth, communication, meaning, all of the rest, they're derivatives of that. So this notion that language is an instrument of reason, well, heck, you didn't need me to make this point. So all you have to do is listen to politicians, and you know language isn't an instrument of reason. So sort of summarizing then, it's not for conveying emotion. It's not for communicating ideas. It's not for sharing information. It's not an instrument of reason. We humans have evolved a very efficient way in which one individual can get another individual to do something. Now, why is that relevant to emotion? Well, come back to that in a bit. Call me on it if you don't catch it. So as I've said, the irreducible function is getting somebody to do something. It can have nonverbal effects, or it can have verbal effects, and everything else is derivative of that. So, as I've already mentioned, in teaching verbal behavior, I'd often run into one of the first things that students will raise their hands about is, well, language is for the communication of feelings. Um, but the imperative is more basic than that. And I think it's important to mention this because Darwin, he got so many other things right. But one of his major books was The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. And so there's another thing hidden in there besides the business of whether it involves language or not. To say we express our emotions is to imply that we're showing something that would otherwise remain unseen, which means we've got some kind of inner condition we know about, but nobody else knows about. And therefore, expressing that tells others what was inside us. Well, what if we take a different tack? What if we think more as behavior analysts and instead we consider that some features of emotions evolve not as inner conditions, but rather because of the effects they have on others. This is not, by the way, to deny that there are inner things. We can certainly feel things inside our own bodies. Um, but think about it. The angry male gorilla surely influences the behavior of those around them. His gestures, his sounds, they're exceedingly effective expressions of his emotions. But hey, if you're confronted by an angry gorilla, you should worry more about the angry gorilla's public behavior than about anything inside him. So um, Darwin made a lot of fascinating observations. He looked at the behavior of primates. He looked at the behavior of children when he wrote that book, and observed many fascinating things. But the notion that underneath it all, it was something you felt inside that drove the showing of emotions may have been a big mistake. And we want to so I'm again repeating things. And once you go through the argument that the angry gorilla tells us that nonverbal primates already express emotions pretty well, they don't need language as a substitute. But if language is a way to change the behavior of others, describing emotions might be a way to get treated differently. You don't understand how you make me feel. That implicitly includes, if you did, you'd treat me differently. So consider whenever you're involved in doing an analysis of or involved, whether your own behavior, the behavior of others, or what, look at the stimuli that set the occasion for the emotional language and look at the consequences that the emotional language may have. So we've gotten far enough along here, and this is essentially we've switched topics. So I think let's do another poll question and get these out of the way.
Okay, everybody, here we go. Go ahead and take some time to answer this one. Here, I'll actually read this one from here and I'll read them. We have argued here that the function of language that led to its evolution was changing the behavior of others as an instrument of reason, the expression of feelings and emotions, or sharing stories around primitive campfires. And go ahead and take some time. Great, thank you all for voting. I'll shut this down. It looks like 61% said changing the behavior of others, 3% said as an instrument of reason, and 36% said the expression of feelings and emotions.
So you said that in spite of the fact that the angry gorilla doesn't need to talk. Okay. By the way, the fourth alternative, that was actually not just made up as being a sort of far-fetched sounding things, but it actually was an alternative suggested in some anthropology textbooks back in the last century. So um, it is among, but words change the behavior of listeners. So moving on. Now, once we're talking about these emotions, well, let's talk about patterns of behavior. Are they causes of behavior? Do we do things because of our emotions? That's certainly part of everyday talk. People say, I did it because you made me angry. So we learned to label patterns of behavior. We say people are happy, they're sad, they're angry, and love. And then later, when they're asked why they do what they do, we turn it all around and suddenly we offer the emotions as explanations for their behaviors. So we've learned as a child, when you see people behaving this way, we call those people angry. When we see people behaving this other way, we call them happy. When we see them behave this other way, we call them sad. When we see people behaving this other way, uh, we say they're in love, whatever. I mean, you can imagine this looking at gorillas, right? But then later we see somebody acting that way and we'd say, why did that person do it? Well, Romeo behaved that way because he was in love. Uh, uh, Othello did what he did because he was angry, and so forth and so on. But that's where we got circular reasoning that snuck in, and it's pervasive in our everyday talk. It's the kind of thing where you're talking about people about with non-professional, non-behavior analytic people about emotions. You'll find again and again that they will be taking a vocabulary which had to be based on watching these different patterns of behavior and giving each of them a different name, and then taking the names later and offering them as explanations for why the behavior happened. In psychology, it is not even too unusual for that sort of thing to sneak into the technical usages. So, for example, if you look at attitudes as one of the constructs that you'll find in social psychology, you you do some experiments or some research in which you record patterns of behavior, and you now have this person or that person who has, well, depending on what literature reading, who has racial prejudices or racial um, attitudes or whatever, or ethnic ones or gender ones, whatever you pick, whatever you want. But if you identify people as behaving in certain ways, and then later on you see people behaving in certain ways and you ask why they did it, if somebody comes back and say it's because of their attitudes or because of their prejudices or because of their disposition, whatever, at that point you've forgotten that these words originated as names for the different patterns of behavior. And to turn around and offer the names as if you somehow explained something, all you've done is talked about how consistent this behavior is over time, and that you tend to see it in certain kinds of situations over and over again. And it's got certain characteristics that are repeated often enough that the name becomes useful. It's important to recognize that. So we define emotions such as happiness, anger, sadness based on how someone acts. When we see such behavior, it won't do to try to explain it by saying the person was happy or angry or sad. If we define attitudes or preferences or prejudices based on their act, we can't try to explain their behavior the next time we see it by saying they had an attitude or a preference or a prejudice. That's just circular reasoning. We should not see it happen in behavior analysis when we deal with these important issues. And they are important. And by the way, it doesn't mean that we can't describe things going on inside us. It doesn't mean that we don't have feelings. Of course we do. And of course our behavior changes under all these situations. But if we're going to deal with it behavior analytically, we've got to ask about its origins, and we've got to ask about its what happens when we do it. In other words, we have to ask about its antecedents and consequences. Another problem with the language of emotion is that it, it we tend to talk in terms of nouns, um, um, uh, and so we've got to worry about. We should be speaking about it attending, not attention, of thinking, not thoughts, of remembering, not memory. The If we switch to the verbs, we're less likely to treat these categories as things rather than as behavior. We often say anger is directed as if it's a thing. And it's curious, we don't usually say somebody angered at someone else. The language of emotion is just so variable, and even its grammatical categories get complicated. Love is sometimes a noun. Somebody can fall in love. Sometimes a verb. We can love or we can be in love. Hate has different kinds of characteristics and different kinds of grammar. We speak of joy and fear and sadness more as something you have than as a way you behave. But if these are classes of behavior with antecedents and consequences, we're at a real disadvantage if we don't have appropriate vocabularies and appropriate verbs. By the way, having gone through this, this is really stuff that has to be worked out in much more detail, because this is just a suggestion of things to worry about. Don't quote any of those sentences and take them seriously. And by the way, a fascinating thing happened just earlier today. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong slide. I'm thinking about one that comes a little while. Skinner was particularly concerned about the notion of inner uh, things as being causes of behavior. And particularly when he was talking about private events, if you think something and something comes up, can it now cause your behavior? And he eventually, in trying to argue about private events, came up with a distinction between initiating and intermediate causes. So here's one quotation from a paper of his. Private events can be brought under the control of especially public behavior. In that case, the private events may be called causes, but they are not initiating causes. And then he talks about some exceptions. The only possible exceptions I can imagine would arise if, when someone had acquired extensive public behavior, a set of private events would resemble a public set well enough to come in existence through generalization. We do engage in productive private verbal behavior in which some initiation certainly occurs, if that term means anything. But if my analysis is correct, that's Skinner talking, public versions must have come first, in which case the initiation passes the environment. Now, unpacking that a little bit. So if you've got a long history of doing arithmetic problems, and you can now do long multiplication, or you can do addition where you've got numbers in the ones and tens and hundreds columns and so forth, you can imagine engaging in that behavior without somebody else seeing it, saying it to yourself just the way you said it when you were looking at the stimuli on the page. Well, we know enough about that history that if kids do this some of the time and we don't see them doing anything, but they come up with the right answer, it makes sense that what they're doing is closely enough related to that original public history that something like that is happening in private. Nevertheless, the environment set it all up in the teaching that led to that, and we see the consequences as well. So that's the sense in which, yes, they were intermediate causes, each of the saying these numbers to yourself as you started adding them up is a causal sequence, but the environment is what set all of this up. And then after discussing all of these kinds of issues and talking about whether you should think about organisms as active or passive, he concluded, whatever the ultimate consequences, the origination of behavior, where it comes from, is still to be sought in natural selection, operant conditioning, and the evolution of cultural practices. Now notice those three things. Again, we're talking about the three kinds of selection which I introduced to you earlier on, the phylogenetic selection a la Darwin, the operant selection a la Skinner, and behavior as it's passed on among individuals and cultural practices. So here I've just got a little bit of point, and I won't repeat it, but essentially I spelled out here doing mental arithmetic and the relation of these kinds of things to the quotation by Skinner. So in the interest of time, we've got a lot still to go. I'm going to move on, and those of you who wish to look at it in more detail, you've got the handout that you can download. So having covered this particular question, let's get on to poll question number 4. Surprising relation between the questions we're asking and the poll questions. Okay, over to you, Marissa.
Alrighty, everybody, go ahead. We have argued here that we should speak of emotion as go ahead, take some time to answer this. Awesome. Thank you all for voting. I'm going to shut this down. Alrighty. It looks like 22% say causes of behavior, 57% say names of certain kinds of behavior, 18% say explanations of behavior, and 3% say unscientific folk wisdom.
Well, thank you for those who said names of behavior. Let me make another little editorial comment. Those of you who are answering, these presentations are actually going to be available for a year or so. BDS has agreed to make them available for people who want to use them for various purposes. People will be able to freely sign on to these. And I don't think that the poll questions can be easily edited out. So you're also showing the rest of the community, which may actually include people even outside of behavior analysis who look at these things, something about your attention to things. So make us proud. Make those answers look good enough that that when these things are repeated and looked at by others, they'll recognize how carefully all of you folks have been attending to the things we've been talking about. Don't mean to be a scold, but I've got to do what I can to make these things effective. And if you have any suggestions for how we could do things in a better way, we'd certainly like to hear about that. But let's move on now. So, okay, we've got this problem that there are private correlates. Certainly, somebody might be not showing much of anything, but if you ask them, oh yeah, I'm really angry with this other person, I haven't confronted that other person yet. So there are emotions, feelings, there are things that we are in contact with that other people are not. So how can a verbal community that only has access to the public ever teach this language of emotions and feelings? This was a problem that Skinner had to confront really early on. And he started worrying about it actually in the early in his career, certainly in the 1930s. It had been a tradition in psychology after behaviorism was established by John B. Watson, for Watson to have said, "Oh well, yeah, we don't have access to any of the private stuff; it's just out of reach, and we can't even talk about it." And he sort of ruled it out as something to discuss. So when Skinner came along, he thought that was a mistake, that to say that we can't discuss the private is to rule out something that's important, because after all, you can have extensions to the private from generalization. There are things similar in the inaccessibility of somebody being private because that person's behind a curtain in a hospital ward or something like that, and somebody feeling things that nobody else can see, except that if somebody is feeling something in the gut, you can't pull the curtain back the way you can in the hospital ward. So, these were problems and issues, and Skinner worked on coming up with a way to talk about the private events. And what he suggested was that the private stuff is typically correlated with the public. The verbal community, mommy and daddy, cannot see what's going on inside this child, but they can see what's happening to the child. They can see what the child is doing. And on the basis of that, they can differentially respond to things that the child says, and therefore shape how the child talks about these various events. So he came up with 4 ways in which public verbal communities can create vocabularies of private events. A reinforcing community with no access to private stimuli may generate verbal behavior with respect to them by basing consequences on. That's really important phrase, by basing consequences on. Common public accompaniments. If the kid falls down, you can and lands on an elbow, that's the time in which you could be asking questions about whether it hurt or not, and so forth. Collateral responses are also part of the public, and they typically go with the other kinds of accompaniment. So if besides you see that the kid's elbow's been scraped and the kid's bleeding, then you've got that as another thing, and you can ask about the hurt, the private event. Now the others are a little bit trickier. Number three is appealing to metaphors, appealing to generalization along all kinds of curious dimensions. So, for example, you can talk about sharp pains and dull pains, but sharp pains are the kinds of pains that are produced by sharp things, and dull pains are the kinds of pains that are produced by dull things. So there's a kind of very indirect derivative of a vocabulary that originated with respect to objects and eventually gets extended by these sorts of mechanisms, by metaphor and so on, to the pains. But it is a way of getting from the public to the private, and it is a way of creating then the vocabulary for the private. And then there's the kind of thing in which the private stimuli are reduced forms of what was originally public. Like child is reading aloud and the teacher says, well, read to yourself, you'll disturb the other children. And eventually the child is doing something that's like the reading aloud, but it no longer shows. But it's similar enough. There's enough things in common that the vocabulary that was established in one case is extended to the other. Now, is it simple? Is it obvious? Is it the kind of thing we can nail down with the kinds of experimental elaborations that we would usually do with a lot of other kinds of behavior? Hell no. And the reason is that in the end, there is the private stuff and there can be distortions. The more the extension of the private, the less well the public verbal community can maintain those classes of behavior. But the implications of that are interesting. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Let's also talk about the modes of access. Okay, they don't have, the parents and the child don't have to have access to exactly the same stimulus in order for the parents to know how to respond when the child says this or the child says that. You've got two people. One of them is a person who's a sighted person, ordinary vision. The other happens to be a person who's blind. And between them, they've got a table on which are a whole bunch of geometric solids. Okay, there's a sphere, there's a cube, there's a pyramid. You can go either way. The blind person can pick up the sphere and hand it to the sighted person and say, this is a sphere. And then can pick up this cube and give it to the sighted person and say, now what's this? And the blind person can reinforce the response, oh yeah, this is a cube. So with those interactions, the blind person can be teaching the sighted person the name for all these solids, but it can go the other way around. The sighted person can pick things up and hand it to the blind person. And if the blind person doesn't know the name for any particular one of these, the sighted person can teach it. And they're talking back and forth, and eventually they're having a conversation. They're being consistent about it. They are both responding to the same objects out there between them, but one of them has access to them as visual stimuli, and the other has access to them as tactile stimuli. But they are public in the sense that they can both make contact with them. Now think of another example. Think about the toothache. We tend to think of the toothache being really, really different for the patient than for the dentist. It's my toothache. I really feel it. It's there. I have direct contact with that toothache, and when I chew on something and with that tooth, I can feel something happening. But if I go to the dentist will make contact with that diseased tooth too. Maybe taking an X-ray, going in with probes, doing all sorts of things. The dentist will not feel my pain, but will be making contact with my tooth. And to the extent that the dentist has learned to discriminate between diseased teeth and healthy teeth, the dentist will be able to talk about it and will be able to teach us too. And if the dentist says, you know, we've got this phenomenon called referred pain, sometimes you have a problem with a tooth in your upper jaw, but it turns out that the decay is in your lower jaw, is a tooth in your lower jaw, and because of the way the nervous system works and whatever. And I've checked these out, I've sampled them, and that's really where the problem is. Now, if you really are not convinced by the dentist, you might say, I want you to work on that other tooth anyway. Most of us would be willing to learn from the dentist, and the proof of whether the dentist was correct or not, whether when the dentist does the procedure on the diseased tooth, it makes it better. But in that particular case, the dentist knew better where the source of the toothache was than you did as the patient. But again, you have one kind of contact with that tooth and the problem in the tooth, and the dentist has a different kind of contact, just as the blind and the sighted person had different kinds of contact with the geometric solids. So the toothache is a discriminable event. You have different access. They have different kinds of contact with it. Neither one is more reliable than the other. And here, for those of you who want to look at it in more detail at your leisure, is it spelling out the referred pain example. The main point here is shared contact with the private event can be in different modalities, and we don't have to assume that the two speakers are responding to the same property or that they are feeling the same thing. No, they can be teaching each other vocabularies. And so this is the way in which Skinner then has the vocabulary working further and further away from the public. And so it was his resolution of this issue of whether we could talk about private events. So it's not about showing and telling. I mean, I did that one case and said, the one person shows this and says, this is a sphere. But it's also got to be that you've got a conversation going on and that what you say has consequences. We could extend this to how the vocabularies, if I remember, I forgot, I never knew, all kinds of other things that we learn are based on complex behavior, but they always depend upon the speaker and the listener both having contact with relevant dimensions. So let's spell this out a little bit more. This is sort of summarizing some of the points here, and then I want to mention another. The main problem with tacting private events is that the verbal community doesn't have the necessary access to shape and maintain it. When somebody leaves a social thing and says, I have a headache, what you don't know is whether there was something going on inside that person's head, something that the person was reporting. Maybe this person who does have migraines, or this is just a convenient way without embarrassment to be able to get out of there because there's somebody you don't want to spend any time with. So on those kinds of grounds, Watson argued that private events have no place in the science of behavior. But this is a language that has a certain consistency to it. Yeah, we cannot always tell whether it's right or not, but that's part of the way, that's part of why it's a private, why we call it a private event. But it does still depend on the public practices of a verbal community. And of course, how this fits into our main topic is that's what talking about feelings is too. They're presumably private events. The implication is interesting. We know what's public better than we know what's private. And that's because the verbal community can keep us honest when it's public, can arrange the contingencies more consistently than when it's private. How did it teach us to say we understand something? Hey, that's a thing in which, what did they get at to teach us to say that? Or how did they teach us to say when we're in love? Or to say when we're uncertain? Or to say when we're happy or we're sad? The language of emotions becomes critical because there is this indirect thing. So So Daddy's there at home, and Junior comes in, and Junior has an older sister, and the sister, because she's older, has been embarrassing him in front of some of his friends, and he's saying, "I hate her, I hate her, I hate her," and Daddy gets him and he pushes him up against the wall and shakes him and says, "You know you love your sister." Now, what is that kid learning about the language of love? Or is it somebody who just watches a lot of soaps or listens to a lot of things or goes through and plays some games on the media in which you are involved with avatars who are going through all of these kinds of things? How does the verbal community create a consistent vocabulary with it, all of those kinds of things? Now, here's a curious thing. Just earlier today, I was looking at some current issues from the American Psychological Sciences journal, Perspectives on Psychological Sciences. And it's curious because it tells us, what does psychology have to say about these issues? And I just caught, this title caught my eye. What we can learn about emotion by talking with the Hadza. The Hadza are hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. So here's the abstract, and I just cannot resist the opportunity to go through it with you. Emotions are often thought of as internal mental states centering on individuals' subjective feelings and evaluations. This is psychologists writing about emotions. This is telling us what we think of emotions as internal mental states, and they involve subjective feelings. This understanding is consistent with studies of emotion narratives. When you talk about emotions, the circumstances in which you have, the descriptions people give for the experienced events they regard as emotions. Yet these studies and contemporary psychology more generally often rely on the observations of educated Europeans and European Americans, constraining psychological theories and methods. The folks writing this paper are saying that these ways of defining emotions places constraints on psychological theory. In this article, we present observations from an inductive qualitative analysis of interviews conducted with the Hadza, a community of small-scale hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, and we juxtapose them with a set of interviews conducted with Americans from North Carolina. I presume that's where they're from. So, although North Carolina event descriptions largely conform to the assumptions of Eurocentric psychological theory, Hadza descriptions foregrounded, listen to this, foregrounded action and bodily sensations, the physical environment, immediate needs, and the experiences of social others. These Hadza should be behavior analysts. They're talking about emotions in terms of behavior, in terms of stimuli, in terms of the environment, in terms of the reinforcers, including the social environment. They have the behavioral way of looking at emotions, not the kinds of things that the Europeans and the European Americans have, which emphasize subjective feelings. So look at what they then conclude. These observations suggest that subjective feelings and internal mental states may not be the organizing principle of emotion in the world around. Qualitative analyses of emotion narratives from outside of a US and Western cultural context has the potential to uncover additional diversity in meaning making, offering a descriptive foundation on which to build a more robust and inclusive science of emotion. Hey, they're ready to join us because this is the perspective, I think, that describes the way I've been trying to talk about emotion and this presentation here today. So it's kind of fun to have just by coincidence have encountered that just this morning. I put this in, it's not in the handout, by the way, folks, because I just put it in. Let me tell you another one. My colleague Phil Heinlein had done a series of informal experiments in class in which he got students to report their feelings. They'd he'd ask them to remember some significant emotional event. For some students, it would be traumatic, all sorts of events. And what he found it was interesting to see that the way in which they described their feelings. And so I just happened to have an opportunity to try out the sorts of things he did. So I did a little thing of my own in one of my classes to extend what he had done. It happened to be a snow day, which disrupted the exam schedule for the course, and the students were coming in on the next day the campus opened. And I'd already put in my syllabus that I wasn't going to give them an exam on the first day after a snow closure. And even though that was in the syllabus, I came into the class that day, the first day after the snowstorm, and I had uh, uh, some sheets of paper and exam booklets under my arm. And I started distributing the papers face down, telling the students not to turn them over until everybody had a copy. They, of course, immediately assumed I'd forgotten what I said on the syllabus and I was giving an exam. So anyway, but when I told them to get started, and they turned over the sheet of paper that says, "This is not an exam. Describe your feelings when you saw me start to hand out the exam booklets." By the way, I told them not to put their names on the papers because I wanted to preserve their anonymity, because I was going to collect the papers and then share some of that in the course. So the instructions said, describe your feelings. Most of the answers were not descriptions of feelings, but were descriptions of the situation. There wasn't supposed to be an exam today. I wasn't prepared for a pop quiz. Or they wrote a question. I wondered what's going on. Most of the reports that were reports of feelings were almost exclusively limited to naming them. I felt nervous. Fear. I felt anxious. There were a few who reported physiological events. Somebody wrote, my heart raced. And a lot of those, most of them were metaphorical. My heart fell to the floor. I don't think that really happened. I think the heart remained right in the chest where it's supposed to be. So in other words, what this kind of a demonstration does is when we talk about our feelings, very often what we say is not about the quality of something going on inside us. We instead provide a commentary about our environment rather than something happening inside of us. This too is consistent with the kinds of things that the Hadza hunter-gatherers were talking about. And so in some ways, our way of talking about it, again, has more in common with them uh, um, than with the traditional uh, European American way of talking about feelings. So let's get one more poll question out of the way.
All right, everybody. When the blind and sighted persons were teaching each other, they were learning the names of emotions, feelings, people, or geometric sounds. That takes some time to answer this one. Great. Thank you all so much for voting. I'm going to shut this down. And perfect. Okay. Looks like 15% said emotions, 9% said feelings, 3% said people, and 72% said geometric solids.
Somewhat better. Good, folks, especially the 72% of you. Okay, let's move on a little bit now. We talked about various kinds of questions. So how can we use behavioral criteria to define emotions? Do we want to define them? What kinds of things can we say about them? In what ways can behavior analysts be useful in talking about emotions? So I want to get a little bit more personal in this sort of thing. I want to talk a little about grief and loss. Okay, and the reason is this is personal is that my wife and I recently lost a cat. His name was Chesapeake. We'd had Chesapeake for about 18 years. He was one of these, uh, uh, we had not intended to adopt him, but he had been a rescue cat, and he's probably about 7 months old when he got him. Um, and he died just a few months ago. But we did have another loss. We lost our son, who was in his 50s, to cancer in 2019, just before the onset of COVID. And so, yes, we do know what loss and grief are. And but one of the curious things, and one of the reasons I thought to incorporate this here, was that we had Chessie put down by a vet who came in and did it here in our home, rather than to take him to a strange environment and to take him to the vets or whatever. And after that was done, they left a brochure, and I was surprised by one of the things in the brochure. It said, uh, some pet owners are surprised to find that they grieve more uh, for their lost pet than for their lost human loved ones. And thought about that a bit. And so our son, who died in 2019, he was involved in work. He worked in the movie and theater business, special effects, but I won't go into that sort of thing. But his work meant that sometimes we wouldn't see him for a couple of weeks at a time, and he'd call on the phone occasionally. When he was involved in some shows, he'd be traveling a lot, so he'd be away for a bit. But Chessie was there day in and day out, every day, in one room or another of the house. So start thinking about stimulus control. And yes, this is a topic about grief and loss, but stimulus control means that um, the pet or the loved one, whichever, is someone with respect to whom you have a lot of history of behavior. And now that behavior remains strong, but the stimulus that occasions it, that allows that behavior, isn't there anymore. And if you've got a pet who's there every day, and you see something move on the periphery and you look around, and sure enough, you're responding, and there the pet is and comes by, that's one kind of behavior. Um, so I have a previous history that led me to think about these kinds of and loss in particular as an emotional issue. I had been at a conference in Tromsø, which is it's the northernmost, the home of the northernmost university in the world. It's in Norway, above the Arctic Circle. And at this conference, it was run by a dear colleague of mine named Terje Sagfolden. And we were at the conference, and we were just getting started, and we were going to be spending the whole conference talking about various aspects of ADHD. Other behavior analysts were there, Peter Colleen, Alan Nuringer, but there were also people involved in the neurosciences, people involved in cultural things involving ADHD. And I had just started to give one of the early talks in the conference, and Terje had introduced me, and then somebody called him out of the room, and he came back in, and he interrupted me and said, "This is important." And he then told us, "My wife has just been killed by a car." And then he collapsed for a moment. Turned out that she was a librarian who, back down in Oslo, which is the other end of Norway, she had been going into the city of Oslo to get some books for the library, was crossing an icy road, and the car went out of control and killed her. He then went back to Oslo with a graduate student of his, and he insisted that we continued the conference. And so, I mean, that was, again, a striking and moving event. We corresponded about it afterwards, and he talked about the problem of not having her there to talk to, and we discussed things like he eventually created a little shrine with her pictures and spent a lot of time talking to her. And gradually over time, he got to the point where he could get back to work again. He was, and for those of you who had losses, you know how these kinds of things can be. One of the things about loss is there are things you cannot do anymore, and they're just gone for good. And you can talk about, being able to do them in some other life and so forth, but that's not a thing we can manage here. And I usually don't think in those terms, but as a basis of these kinds of things, we do things like make sure we have pictures around. Um, you can never duplicate the original behavior, but at least you can create um, the opportunity for some little parts of it. And I think under those conditions, every little bit helps. Because after a while, you start also engaging in the kinds of behavior, which is the happy sort of things. You look at the pictures that remind you of those sorts of events. Thinking behaviorally about loss, I think, makes a difference. Um, and what about all of the other emotions? I mean, we could talk of emotional behavior in terms of the causes. So if we talk about fear, if we talk about anxiety, if we talk about anger, those are typically kinds of behavior that occasioned by aversive stimuli. Um, uh, and I think maybe a difference between the fine gradations among different kinds may be whether or not some behavior is available that will get you away from the aversive stimuli that have produced some of these sorts of things. Anger seems to be a kind of behavior in which the reinforcer becomes doing damage or giving hurt to some other individual or organism. And in fact, there's a whole body of research that was done back in the 60s in which Nate Azarin, Don Hake, Ron Hutchinson, some others did experiments in which you showed that in the given aversive stimuli, monkeys would attack other monkeys. Given transition from reinforcement to extinction, pigeons will attack other pigeons, or rats will attack other rats. So that aversive stimuli tended to produce behavior in which the reinforcer was getting access to another organism that you can then hurt. Once you start thinking about anger that way, um, those who have to deal with it can perhaps think about possible changes and contingencies that could make a difference. One of the very curious things about that whole body of research is that Ron Hutchinson was continuing some of it and got a whole series of NSF grants. And a senator named Proxmire gave him, I forget what the award was called, not the Fickle Finger, but some kind of, it had a name in those days, in which essentially was making fun of certain kinds of research. And given that trying conditions, poverty, cases in which you can't feed your kids, given that that tends to be correlated with an increase in crime, it seemed that sort of research is incredibly relevant to to public issues of sources of crime and so forth. And yet, Proxmire could not see any of its relevance. And of course, we behavior analysis now are reluctant to do research that involves aversive events. You can take all of these sorts of things, release, and start asking about the sorts of things that go with them. Joy, hope, anticipation, they typically involve important reinforcers that have become available. Sorrow or grief, we've already talked about, hey, they may involve the termination of reinforcers. And all of these cases, we can see other things about things we might be able to do when we start thinking about them in terms of the availability of behavior. So the vocabulary of emotion, it's a complicated vocabulary. It's based on complex relationships involving all sorts of situations, different kinds of behavior. But after all, these vocabularies come from people looking at each other's behavior in a variety of different kinds of situations. It's no surprise that it's variable, and it's variable enough even within a single culture like the American culture, as opposed to talking about cultures. But tacts of love, of hate, joy, sorrow, whether they're in ourselves or in others, they depend on overt manifestations, laughter, tears. Tears are another overt kind of sign that does make a difference in behavior. And there's a body of research that shows that the way humans interact with each other depends on whether um, on what's going on in the eyes. Tearing does make a difference. But not only those kinds of overt manifestations, but the circumstances under which we see the behavior. Just the variability of our language of emotions provides the evidence of how subtle the things we tact are. But they can't be based solely on what's inside us. If they were solely on what's inside us without the public correlates, you could never have created a verbal community in the first place. And you couldn't maintain any consistency whatsoever in the vocabulary of emotions. Yes, it's variable. Different people mean different things when they talk about love, when they talk about other kinds of things. The language of hate, unfortunately, has become far more prominent in our culture than it used to be. But no matter what the politicians say, we cannot feel each other's pains. Here's one more poll question, though, and then we'll sum up a bit and have time for questions, I hope. Other kinds of questions.
Alrighty, everybody. Our behavioral account of grief defined it mainly in terms of unavailability of behavior, whether the griever can describe it, recency of loss, or how the loss occurred. And go ahead and take some time to answer this one. Great, thank you all for voting. I'm watching that number go up. I'm gonna shut it down. Okay, it looks like 55% said unavailability of behavior, 27% said whether the griever can describe it, 10% said recency of loss, and 9% said how the loss occurred.
And of course, the correct answer was A, the unavailability of the behavior. Um, um, you thought you saw that shadow moving, but it wasn't Jesse. He's not here anymore. So let's sum up a bit now. We considered, remember, 5 main questions. To what extent is emotional behavior affected by operant contingencies? I hope I made the case strongly enough that yes, they play a substantial role. Stimuli can change the probabilities of the behavior we call emotional just in an instant. Remember, the example was the faculty member walking in on the graduate students who are having an argument. Talked about how emotions might have evolved, and that was especially concerned with making the case. Once you start thinking about evolution, uh, you have to turn to the public manifestations because it's hard to understand why such behavior might evolve if it was mainly about something going on inside. If it doesn't do something that affects other organisms, why should the showing of emotions even matter? Are the emotions the causes of behavior? Well, if the emotions are the things inside, then the trouble with that is what made them happen. And as always, we find as behavior analysts that we do well by turning toward environments and environmental contingencies. 4 was essentially an extension of those arguments. If these are emotions and feelings are private, we have to deal with the question of how a verbal community can set up that appropriate language. The language can only be based on what's public, and so we got to look toward the public to figure out how we got to even develop a language about emotions and feelings. Once again, don't misunderstand that we're saying that there are no such things as emotions and feelings. No, they're important. They're incredibly important. But we come to different kinds of conclusions about what's going on when we look at these things behaviorally. And so that gives us some hint about how we can use behavioral criteria to define emotions. We have a little bit of time left, and I think we'd still have a little bit of time for questions. I want to wrap up with another case in which this is a case in which emotional behavior uh, um, was involved, my own emotional behavior was involved, and in which I found that thinking behaviorally really made a big difference. Turns out that for many years, I didn't know it, but there's a substance called tyramine. It's a derivative of fermentation. It's found in lots of foods and drinks. Beer has it, aged cheeses have it, processed meats, soy sauce, red wines, coffees, colas, chocolate. In fact, just about every source of caffeine has a bit of tyramine in it. Now, if you're sensitive to tyramine, you might be somebody who gets migraine headaches. Um, I didn't know it, but I had different symptoms, and I got a facial rash typically if I had too much tyramine. In other words, have beer and a pizza, and you got a lot of tyramine. But actually, I had behavioral symptoms. I didn't know it at the time, but too much tyramine made me a bit paranoid, gave me bad dreams, and lowered my anger thresholds. Now, this was a thing that had developed in, maybe my 20s and 30s. I eventually concluded that my father also had it, but I'll save a little bit of that. And these kinds of symptoms, by the way, were probably harder on our family on me. I don't want to go into details, but it's fair to say that in those days I was sometimes hard to get along with. So I've been short-tempered. I suffered occasionally from facial rashes early in my academic career. In the spring of 1980, I had a sabbatical and I visited my colleague, Terry Sagvold, and he's the one I already mentioned with respect to the topic of grief. But that was one of my first visit to the University of Oslo in Norway. And I went from there after 3 or 4 weeks with Terje, attending a professional meeting in London. Well, in Norway, there I was on my own. My symptoms vanished. But one of the things that was true about the Norway trip was I had a totally different kind of diet. Um, Rarely had anything alcoholic, certainly very little beer. Um, and about the only kinds of aged cheeses I would have was in the smorgasbord breakfast. And during those 3 weeks, I concluded I escaped from the stress of work and family life. So after about 3 weeks, I moved on to London. And there, if you have a pub lunch, you have aged cheeses, you have a pint, and all the symptoms returned. So by the time I got back home, I was thinking not about what was different socially and professionally about my environment, but I began to be thinking about what I was eating and drinking. Back on campus at UMBC, we often had an afternoon faculty reception in which wine and cheese were served. So I tried abstaining from the wine, but I did then eat the cheese. And another time I tried abstaining from the cheese, but I did have the wine. And neither made much difference. It hadn't occurred to me that I should try abstaining from both. So the role of tyramine in migraine headaches was newly developed at the time. An allergist gave me a list of foods high in tyramine, suggesting I should see what happened if I remove them. So I went cold turkey. I got rid of everything with tyramine in my diet. And soon my symptoms disappeared, but suddenly I was agitated. I had headaches, deep muscle pains in my legs, because by taking away all my sources of tyramine, I was taking away all my sources of caffeine. And I discovered that I was caffeine addicted. Probably most of us who drink coffee are. But how often do we go for 24 or 48 hours without any caffeine whatsoever? My wife made me a cup of coffee, and literally within seconds after my first sip, all those new symptoms disappeared. I had been on caffeine withdrawal. Caffeine is addictive, but without most of the problems of narcotic substances. And most of us don't ever go without caffeine long enough to get withdrawal. Now I mostly take my caffeine fixes in the form of tea, which contains a lot less tyramine than coffee or colleagues. And my sensitivity to tyramine seems to have diminished as I got older. I must concede I still do get angry from time to time, but it's a different sort of behavior than once it was. I mentioned changes in thresholds. We tend to think about causes, but we tend not to think about things that can change the thresholds. What kind of bad thing can happen that'll move you over the threshold for showing angry behavior? Um, Tyramine was one of the things that made those thresholds lower, so it took a lot less than it otherwise might have. So emotional behavior, like other responses to environmental events, has multiple causes. And so chemical substances in foods like tyramine can change those thresholds. So clearly, tyramine made my anger thresholds lower. And in coping with behavioral problems, we often look to stimuli functioning as antecedents or as consequences, but we shouldn't overlook variables that may only change the thresholds. So learning about tyramine made a difference. Sometimes my symptoms reappeared, and on checking my recent diet, I discovered I had unwittingly consumed something that contained lots of tyramine. More important, from then on, I found myself on the verge of shouting about something, and I could ask myself whether it was because of something my wife or one of my sons had done, or because it was something I'd eaten. And that was often good enough. I'm told that my personality changed once I began to work on the consequences of tyramine. I am now convinced also that my father had that problem, and unfortunately, we never did um, know enough to work on the diet as being part of it. The consequences about asking about the contingencies that shape and maintain emotional behavior, they're really different from asking about making the assertion that people act as they do simply because their emotions made them do it. A behavioral view of the emotions can have remarkable practical consequences. So there's part of my story. It jumps around a bit, but we're only beginning to learn about how to think about and deal with these kinds of things. And certainly behavior analysis, and I've tended to refer to the stories that involve myself, which I know best, but I'm sure all of you, and especially those of you who may have practice of dealing with adults, will know of other cases in which we behavior analysts can make a difference if we talk in behavior analytic ways about emotions. So given that, hey, I'd like to have feedback. So if you have questions, comments, now's the time for them.
Alrighty, everybody. Thank you all, and thank you, Charlie, so much for doing this. Everybody, thank you so much. Go ahead, buy your CEUs while you can. I'll be doing all the data analyzation tomorrow morning from today's participation within the polls in your attendance. If you have any questions, go ahead, throw them in the questions box. I will start reading them off. If you have to go, it's okay. You've met your CEU hours, but we'll continue for a couple of minutes at least. And here we go. So, do you have any opinion on the use of acceptance and commitment therapy training as a behavior analytic intervention?
Well, I'm not much involved in it. I've certainly read about it. I've known Steve Hayes for a long time. Steve, by the way, spent a sabbatical year at UMBC in the early years when I was there. So he and I have argued about some things for a long time. It certainly seems to be effective, and it certainly is concerned with emotional behavior and with its causes. Um, I sometimes have taken issue with some aspects of relational framing, but that's a different kind of story. But to the extent that that's a piece of it, I worry more about uh, dealing with the histories that create those kinds of things. So, yeah, and as I said in the conclusion, many folks doing behavior analysis of one variety or another deal with these kinds of issues. Um, but I'm sure that Steve would also argue that it's emotional behavior that we're concerned with. And I'm sure also that you would agree that the way we talk about it can make a difference. So, but I don't do that sort of thing myself, so I'm not really well equipped to talk in an informed way about it. So I've tended to use the examples I know best.
Alrighty. So, how did you come upon Hasda article? Have you found it useful to describe, address, explain, or point out circular reasoning when working with non-behavior analysts?
I'm sorry, I missed the first sentence. Could you say the first sentence again? I didn't
How did
catch all the.
yeah, how did you come upon the Hasda article?
Oh, I just I'm a member of the APS, the the Association for Psychological Science, and they have a journal called Perspectives on. Well, let's see. Let me. Um, Perspectives on Psychological Science, and so it's a regular journal, and I typically get the table of contents in my email once in a while. And while I was going through my email this morning, I just happened to look at it. I was just mainly looking at the titles, quickly doing a quick scan. I knew I was doing this. And when I saw that it was a paper about emotion, I figured, well, I might as well look at that. And then I was curious with talking with the Hadza. Well, who are the Hadza? They must be people if it's talking with them. So it was just a plain coincidence. Um, uh, and it seemed once I'd gotten to the point of getting into it to find out who the Hadza were, it just hit me that theirs was a particularly behavioral thing. I thought that was just interesting enough that I might as well tell you folks a little about it, given the opportunity. Hey, it doesn't hurt to give them a little press too, right? So
Uh,
no particular design to it. It was just lucky accident.
all right. Can you please talk more about the explanation of fear being inability to escape? Also, what is behavioral explanation of crying as an expression of loss when no one is around?
Ah, okay. Two questions. Well, in the whole history of psychology trying to tackle emotion, back in the early days, there used to be debates. Do you run because you're afraid, or are you afraid because you run? And so you could take either of those positions. Um, People often talk about not even thinking about it if they're in a dangerous position and they're doing things and they're uh, running, getting out of a perilous thing, running out of a burning building, whatever. They're not thinking about, they don't describe that so much as being afraid. And they're more likely to describe being afraid when they're in a situation in which they're in danger but can't do anything about it. So being afraid while you're waiting for the ambulance to show up is very different from what you say you feel once the ambulance gets there, and they're either doing something for either you or whoever the person was that you called them for, if you made a 911 call. Um, but the language of fear that, and if you're talking about other people, um, you could not see them at all, but you could know that well, for example, you could know that the air raid sirens have gone off. I tend to think of stories about bombings during World War II. Nowadays, we can think about what goes on in the Ukraine, um, but uh, people. But remember, we are talking about words that are part of the vocabulary in a culture, and that vocabulary is going to be variable, highly variable. Some people have learned it in some situations, others in other situations. Um, Kids who are in jeopardy in various ways can hear from mommy or daddy, "Oh, don't be afraid, I'll take care of you." Um, uh, so that the different ways in which the words function in the language are going to be as variable as whole variety of other words. We as behavior analysts encounter these kinds of situations, and we're not obliged to take the everyday colloquial vocabulary and come up with a firm behavioral definition based on that. It's not our job. So what I'm trying to do here is to make the point that there are lots of situations in which we encounter words in the everyday vocabulary, and then we co-opt them, we take them over. And once we do that, we try to do it in a technical way. And then we try to come up with a definition in which we can ask students questions about it in exams, or we can define it because we're going to write a paper about this stuff. And we've got to tell our audience what our definition is of this kind of thing for the purpose of this particular experimental paper. Those are very different things. Writing a definition for a glossary is one thing. Interpreting what's going on in an everyday conversation is something very different. And so we've got to recognize that's an ambiguity in the way our field works. Another example, I've talked in this series about words like discrimination and generalization. Well, they're words out in the general population. But if you're going to talk with different ethnic groups, different racial groups, and you're going to start talking about discrimination, you're talking about colloquial usages that are very different from what we do. I mean, I used to waltz into classes in the old days and start talking about discrimination, sort of brush off any of the other possible social implications by saying, yeah, I know that this is significant in other ways, but I'm going to be talking about this just in a technical sense. And in a technical sense, you can give a pretty precise definition, but that doesn't mean you've addressed what's going on when people are talking about discrimination out there in American culture, and especially contemporary American culture with all of the websites and the hate talk and all of the other things that are going on that politicians have made even messier in recent years. So maybe don't worry about those details. So it's good enough to have read a lot of the literature and get a good sense of what's going on. If you know something about the situations, yeah, comfort a child and say, okay, it's over now. You don't have to be afraid anymore. That's perfectly fine, but that's an everyday usage. It's not a behavior analytic usage. If, however, we want to spell out that when this stimulus is there, this is likely to happen, then we want to bring in our behavior analytic talk. And I guess we have to start with being sure we can get it right ourselves. And is it important for us then to get the layperson to talk about it? I don't know. It'll depend on the details, and it'll depend on whether you're working with somebody who you've got as a client, or whether you're talking about a family situation, or you're just having a casual conversation about it. Verbal behavior is many different things to many different people, and although we aspire to defining things, we've got to recognize that verbal behavior is more slippery than that, and the histories vary. Now, that was a long thing I took up with respect to just the first part of the question. The second part of the question, a colleague of mine, his name is, a late colleague of mine, his name is Robert Provine. He wrote he had two books, the first of which was on laughter, and the second of which was called Curious Behavior. And I mentioned this, even though you brought up the specific question about tears and crying. Laughter too has some of the property there. One of the things he discussed was that there is characteristic behavior that's very different from the rest of verbal behavior, and you can study the circumstances under which it occurs. And he particularly started looking at laughter and yawning, and found that they were both contagious, and that if one person laughs, somebody in the audience is likely to laugh too. If one person yawns, somebody in the audience is likely to yawn also. Well, it turns out that there are stimuli which tend to produce very reliably, without regard to whether it's reinforced or not, similar patterns of behavior. Laughter is like that. Uh, uh, Yawning is like that. And crying too has some characteristics, and humans are idiosyncratic in some of the circumstances under which they do it. If Provine late in his career was turning to looking at crying and found that there were distinctive things about the evolution of the human eye, and that seeing the whites of the eyes actually has some effects in changing human behavior, some of which we call emotional. Not all of our behavior is totally operant. And, there are physiological effects. There are kinds of responses that are very dependent on eliciting stimuli and far less manipulable by their consequences. Tearing and crying seems to be some of the, and they tend to be tied in with other kinds of behaviors. So you tend to get certain things happening together. Actors who show emotional behavior can get themselves to the point of crying. But it's a tricky kind of thing, and apparently takes. Apparently, if you're in acting classes, you learn ways to make this kind of thing more or less likely. So it's fairly. All of these things are fairly complex, and people could probably write books about any one of them. But the distinction between behavior that's mainly occasioned by discriminative stimuli and then maintained by consequences, and behavior that the stimuli generate and consequences can only do limited amount, is relevant to things like crying and other classes of behavior. And the best we can do is essentially try to classify them into categories. Certainly, though, it is a kind of behavior that's produced by certain kinds of aversive stimuli, but the crying that comes about because a kid has been injured is different from the crying that comes about because of a loss, and personal loss and grief and so on. I guess I hope that helps a little bit. I know it's a bit, I haven't given you a definitive answer, but at least some of the issues to think about.
Alrighty. Do you want to take another question?
Yeah, let me wait, add one follow-up. And if you have something that comes up that you'd like to follow through and it doesn't get asked here, my email address is Catania, spelled like my last name, at UMBC, where I am, .edu. Send me an email. If I don't answer the first time, write again, because I get a lot of email and I try to answer all of it, but sometimes things get just lost, but I'd be happy to give it a shot. And as I say, don't give up. If I don't answer the first time, remind me. If I don't answer within a week or two, send me the question again. I'll get it sooner or later. Sorry,
Uh,
Marissa, to get that in.
no, not a problem. Alrighty. Oh, hi, Tom. Tom Dozier says, what about emotion as motivating operations?
Well, to the extent that it can set up something, if one of the examples I gave earlier was the opportunity for aggression as a reinforcer. So if anger is produced by aversive events, and aversive events make the reinforcer hurting somebody else, which, I mean, you talk about spousal abuse and all of these kinds of things in which the angered spouse claims, well, you made me angry and therefore you deserved it. But the reinforcer typically is what happens, and then you get the complications that the remorseful spouse under those circumstances then interacts with the injured one, and they work things out, and that becomes a reinforcer. But to the extent that it's a reinforcer for the sequence, it may reinforce some of the earlier stages too. It gets pretty complicated, but in all of those things, it seems like what we're talking about are that the so-called emotional, well, it's not the emotional behavior, but the emotion is causing this changing what the reinforcers are. And to the extent that, of course, it's motivational as well. Yeah, no question about it. It will vary with respect to the, I mean, clearly there are reinforcers that are involved if you're talking about love as an emotion. And I leave you all to, you can, um, and there we're not talking about aversive stimuli. So I invite you to spend some time doing about that and come out of this not thinking just about the aversives, but about the positives as well.
Alrighty, so do you think hope could be an appropriate replacement for fear in the context of behavior and emotions, specifically in dealing with addictions?
Oh my, that's, well, again, is hope a thing or is it something you have or is it a name for certain patterns of behavior? Um, do you say that, somebody has given up on something and, well, have hope essentially is correlated with keep trying. And yeah, trying to set things up so that there's a potential reinforcement. In a way, trying to instill hope is trying to set up another kind of motivational or establishing operation. So again, remember that these are categories that come from the everyday language, that come from folk talk, folk psychology. My guess is that there are some big consistencies across cultures in some of the major emotional classes, but there are also lots of differences. So my guess is that in different cultures you'll get different answers to those kinds of questions. But but sure, motivating observations have to be important in those kinds of issues too. But try not to think about the emotions as things. They are names for certain categories of behavior. And therefore, to then say that they are causes of the behavior for which you've given them the names is a little bit problematic. So be careful about which comes first. And so part of the problem of naming them that way is then you forget to name the behavior and forget to name the consequences and the antecedents. It's tricky. Talk to the Hadza.
Alrighty, do you want to take another one?
I can take, yeah, the folks want to keep coming. I guess we should probably wrap up fairly soon though, but yeah, sure, let's try one more.
Alrighty, so can you talk more about your concerns with the idea of relational frames from your own verbal behavioral framework?
Huh. Well, I think a lot of the literature on relational frames, first of all, by the way, relational frames they run through Skinner's verbal behavior. You can now get copies of the book Verbal Behavior, which are in PDF format, and you can do a search for the word frames. You'll find out they come again and again and again. And Skinner talked about relational frames in a way that's fairly consistent with the way. So I don't have problems with that part of it. What I do have problems are two problems. One is I don't see sufficient concern with how you build them. Um, yes, it's some kind of a history. Different people have different kinds of histories. When I look at the literature on relational frames and I look at some experiments, I find some that don't even ask what is already there in the repertories before you look at, before you do an experiment on some frames and whether they exist or not, or try to train some frames and do the experiments in which you create new nodes and so forth, and you ask about the frames being extended. I'd like to know more about histories. Um, the other part is that frames are useful only up to a point, but you sometimes get to the point where frames interfere with each other. And I know that Steve worries about those kinds of things when you get into practical situations in therapy and so forth. But you can have various classes, and this, by the way, is really a topic for a different kind of presentation. So you can have a higher order class like following orders in the military, and then the lower order class is all the specific things you're asked to do. They can be inconsistent with each other. The higher order thing leads you to obey orders, but when you get a specific order that is going to put you in a position of doing something life-threatening, um, you may be less likely to follow that order. And there's a case where the higher order class and the frame that defines it is inconsistent with the lower order class and the individual and some of the individual members. And I think we need to know more about the ways in which that can happen, and also the ways in which you can break the frames. Because prejudices are frames that that need to be broken. Mickey Keenan, who's in Belfast in Ireland, um, worries about the frames that hold together things for the Protestant Irish and the Catholic Irish. And so in the Protestant Irish, the color orange has a significance that it doesn't have for the Catholic Irish, where green is the color. And if you start looking at things like names, flags, kinds of behavior, foods, there are a whole bunch of things that hang together for the Protestant Irish, and a bunch of things that hang together for the Catholic Irish. And Mickey's experiments show that it's hard to create frames in which the common node is one that connects something from the one class to something in the other class. But yet he finds that the further on into the university students get, the more likely it is to be able to do that. So the breaking down the frames is part of what has to happen for those groups who have often conflicted with each other to come more and more to come together. So we need to learn a lot more about how you break down frames, not just how you create them. And I think what we need there are then studies about creating those contingencies. And I would just wish there's more about the histories rather than studying what the frames are that are around. And Skinner's book, by the way, does have some hints for ways you can go there. Another person who has written about those issues with respect to framing, well, actually, I'm not sure he's written about it. Phil Heinlein is concerned with some of these kinds of issues too. But that actually is a topic for a whole nother thing I'm not prepared to get into right now. So thank you all for your attention to this, and we've got more topics coming up. I really do appreciate the feedback. Be well, and if you're going to be involved with emotions, I hope you will, and I hope that it's happy ones. Okay, thank you and take care.
Alrighty, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.